Hello, everyone. I'm Ron Vale, the Executive Director of Janelia Research Campus, and I'd like to welcome you this evening to a very special dialogues conversation with our distinguished guest, Dr. Anthony Fauci. So tickets to this event were gobbled up within minutes. So I believe that Dr. Fauci is very well known to everyone in this audience. So my opening remarks can be very brief. So Dr. Fauci has had a remarkable 54-year career at the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, which is part of the NIH. And he joined the institute as a physician scientist and became its director in 1984. And in his nearly 4-decade-long term as director, Dr. Fauci has served as advisor for 7 presidents over the course of 11 terms. And Dr. Fauci also held the additional role of President Biden's chief medical advisor in 2021 and 2022. And then after retiring from the NIH at the end of 2022, he joined the faculty of Georgetown University as distinguished professor in the School of Medicine, and he also holds an appointment in the McCourt School of Public Policy. So during his career, Dr. Fauci has been at the front line of understanding and responding to emerging pathogens, which have included HIV, SARS, swine flu, MERS, Ebola, and of course, COVID-19. And in 2021, Dr. Fauci received the National Academy of Sciences prestigious Public Welfare Award for, and quote, decades-long leadership in combating emerging infectious diseases, from the AIDS crisis to the COVID-19 pandemic, and being a clear, consistent, and trusted voice in public health. And Time magazine named Fauci and the frontline healthcare workers as Guardians of the Year in 2020. And the year before, he was inducted into the inaugural class of the U.S. Government Hall of Fame. And for his earlier work on the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, also known as PEPFAR, President George W. Bush awarded Dr. Fauci the Presidential Medal of Freedom, which is the highest civilian honor in the United States. And he also received the Lasker Award for Public Service for the same effort. And it's estimated that PEPFAR has saved more than 25 million lives, primarily in Africa. So in this Janelia Dialogue series, which many of you have attended, we've hosted some remarkable individuals, remarkable not just in their accomplishments, but also in their personal qualities and humanity. And Dr. Fauci is cut from the same cloth. At his very core, Dr. Fauci is a physician who deeply cares about the patient. And even during his busy life as director and analyzing public health statistics, he has never lost sight of an understanding of what patients and their families go through. Indeed, it is his caring for the individual that has driven his tireless work to mitigate the suffering of millions of people from the burden of disease, not just in this country, but also around the world. So, Dr. Fauci, it is a great honor to host you today at Janelia. And in this House of Science, I also want to add that we have deep respect and gratitude to you for your unwavering support of science and reason at times when such a voice has been most needed. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's give a warm welcome to our guest, Dr. Anthony Fauci.
Good to see you. Thank you so much. You're welcome. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, Dr. Fauci, thank you so much for coming to Janelia. And it's wonderful for me, but you can see for the entire audience to be able to see you today here in person. So we're very grateful. And I also want to express my gratitude to you for participating in a virtual conversation that we had, which was the first time we met in February of 2022, which was right during Omicron,
Right.
which was part of Janelia's global seminar series at the time called Life Science Across the Globe. So both for doing that and now, and we know your time is very precious, we're deeply appreciative.
Thank you. My pleasure. Good to be here.
Wonderful. Well, I usually start off these dialogue events with our distinguished guests on kind of a personal note, really going back to the beginning, back to their childhood and their families, and also the environment and how that influenced their trajectory in life. So in researching you, I also found that we have at least one thing in common. Both of our grandparents immigrated from Europe to the United States through Ellis Island in New York and made Brooklyn their home. So maybe you can just start off telling us a little bit about growing up in Brooklyn, and in particular would love to hear about the values in your family and kind of how that influenced what's important to you in your life.
Well, yeah, so thank you for that question. So you're right. I am from Brooklyn, which will be obvious to you after a few minutes of listening to me. I was born in the Bensonhurst section of Brooklyn, which is back I was born a long time ago, the end of 1940. And it was an Italian-American neighborhood, like 98% of that. And it was very interesting the way the neighborhoods in New York were very ethnically and family-oriented. So I lived in a neighborhood that was very warm and nourishing, of everybody. My father was a pharmacist, and in the 1940s and 50s, the local pharmacy was not the CVS and the Walgreens that you have today. The local pharmacist served as kind of the surrogate physician for the neighborhood, combination counselor, marriage counselor, psychiatrist, and what have you. So right from the very beginning, before I really was, understood different identities and professions, the idea of serving the public was really at my father and mother's core. He wasn't a particularly good businessman, so we weren't particularly well off. The pharmacy, I think maybe with just the expenses of living, broke even every year. So it wasn't, they were making a lot of money. So from the beginning, I always had this feeling that it was part of your DNA to be serving people in some way. I wasn't sure I wanted to be a physician, and I certainly wasn't sure I wanted to be a scientist then. But then the evolution of my education just fortified that. I went to a Catholic elementary school in Brooklyn in the Bensonhurst section, Our Lady of Guadalupe, taught by the Dominican nuns who gave you very tough love in elementary school. Nobody fooled around with the nuns. And then I went to a Jesuit high school in Manhattan, taking multiple local and express trains from Brooklyn to Midtown, East Side Manhattan. And the Jesuit tradition fortified the idea of public service. So it was a classical background. I mean, it was a very unusual educational experience where I took 4 years of Greek, 4 years of Latin, 3 years of French, and the usual science courses that you take, which then got me to the next phase, which happened to be another Jesuit school, the College of the Holy Cross in Worcester, Massachusetts, which again, the motto of both of those schools was men for others. There were no women in my high school, and there were, at the time, Holy Cross was not yet co-ed. So the motto was men for others, where it was public service. So I wanted to do something in that, but then I became enamored of science and learning about science. So that's what got me into the medical profession. And that's where I went into medical school, wanting to, quote, serve the public as a physician. Not yet thinking I was going to be an official public servant, because I interpreted it quite, I think, accurately, that physicians and scientists are actually public servants, because what they're doing is for the betterment of mankind.
So just following up on this theme about your education, and I like this quote, which is apropos to the training that you had at Holy Cross. But and this is from a book, Fauci, Expect the Unexpected from National Geographic. But the quote is, the best route to truth is science, philosophy, art, all of the above. For me, science comes first, but I got to where I am through understanding the human spirit. And I was wondering if you could just comment on that, you took the classics, you took philosophy, which is becoming increasingly less common these days. But I wonder if you could reflect on how that kind of humanity training kind of influenced you as a scientist, physician, and public health.
I'm convinced that it has had a profound influence on how I look at an element of my profession as a physician, scientist that evolved into someone that got very much involved in public health and global health, first domestic and then global health. Because I always felt, and even when I was taking care of an individual patient, it sounds perhaps somewhat trite, but I always felt it sincerely that I learned about humanity through studying the classics. I mean, people will say, well, what does translating the Iliad and the Odyssey from Greek to English mean to anything? Well, I mean, I can't translate anything but a Greek menu now, but the fact is that got me to understand different civilizations, which learns about people. So I was interested much more in the person that had the disease than the disease that the person had. And that has served me, I believe, very well as an individual physician who has taken care of literally probably thousands of patients in my career. But it also did not take away from the scientific aspect of it. It was sort of like an interesting merging of appreciation of the plight of the patient at the same time as being extremely well versed in the medical and scientific aspects of what they had. So I really credit that years of educational experience in the humanities as important as my understanding pathogenic mechanisms, quite frankly.
Well, that's wonderful. Maybe it's something we should try to promote more in our education system. But anyway, so you touched upon now your evolution from the humanities to becoming a physician, and you graduated from Columbia Medical School.
No, Cornell.
Cornell. And came to the NIH as a physician scientist. And very early on in your career, you had remarkable success on a problem you were studying, which was an autoimmune form of vasculitis. And you basically changed the trajectory of that disease to almost certain death to something that became treatable. And I was wondering if you could, many people here may not know that story, but I also wonder if you can comment on, kind of your personal and emotional, to get some window into that experience for you, because getting some new insight, making a discovery is, first of all, a fantastic thing about science. But it's also pretty rare when that insight actually translates, to the patient in front of you in such a dramatic way.
Yeah.
So anyway, maybe...
well, just one comment before I directly give you the answer is that my intention when I came from my residency training of multiple years of residency to come to the NIH was to get a combined fellowship in infectious diseases and clinical immunology. And at that point, clinical immunology was still in its very nascent phase. We didn't really know hardly anything. It was mostly mouse and guinea pig and rabbit immunology and not human immunology. And it was that 3-year fellowship. My intention was to go right back to New York Hospital and to be practicing medicine on 68th Street and York Avenue. That's really what I wanted to do. But when I got to the NIH and understood the importance of discovery and what discovery meant, that you could have the multiplier effect of not just the individual patient you're taking care of, but that if you could make some sort of discovery. Now, in direct answer to your question, there was a group of diseases that were inflammatory autoimmune diseases of vessels. They were uncommon. The one that we were studying was Wegener's granulomatosis, which now the current name is granulomatosis with polyangiitis, and other diseases like polyarteritis nodosa. Now, most of you may not have even heard of those diseases, but they're uncommon, but not rare. But they had an 100% to 95 to 100% fatality. But it was clearly an autoreactive disease. And one of the ways that you could think about suppressing it, people were given glucocorticoids, steroids, and everybody still died, either a renal or a pulmonary or a stroke death. The fatality was just, really close to 100%. I was fortunate to have a really generous and insightful mentor, Dr. Sheldon Wolf, who was fundamentally a clinical person who was a good thought provoker for science, but not a practicing bench scientist, who put me on a project to see if we could figure out a way to put this 100% disease into remission. Now, as it happened, I think this is an interesting story. I hope you do. I was the infectious disease consult because I was board certified in infectious disease. And we would go to the Cancer Institute. The NIH Clinical Center for Infectious Disease was on the 11th floor, and the Cancer Institute was the 12th and the 13th floor of the NIH Clinical Center. So we would get called to be infectious disease consult for cancer patients who were given chemotherapy. By the way, they were a very successful group. They developed the cure for acute lymphoblastic leukemia, and the cure of Hodgkin's disease was developed on those floors. But the problem is that some of the patients, when you suppress their immune response with combination of 4 or 5 cytotoxic agents, a patient would get leukopenic and some of them would die of either bleeding or infection. So we were called up. So when I went up to the ward, we were looking at these different drugs that were being used, and they were used at phenomenally high doses to completely wipe out the tumor, including the bone marrow, hopefully that the tumor would be gone and the bone marrow would respond and come back. So we had the idea of, why don't we take one of those drugs, cyclophosphamide, instead of giving it in gram doses, giving it about 1 to 2 milligrams per kilogram, and to monitor the white count so that it never goes below a certain level, so the patient is never in danger of getting a secondary infection. So we started that on our group of patients who were coming in, all of whom, as I mentioned, would be dying. And we started off and gave them cyclophosphamide at 1 to 2 milligrams. And at the NIH, you could do that because you have the clinical center. You could keep them in the hospital for 6 months, because there was no cost for them. And we would follow them every single day. And we started to notice that patient after patient after patient, after about 3 weeks to a month on cyclophosphamide, went into complete remission. That feeling of that kind of dramatic response, it's almost like if you were at the bench and you were doing something and you had an experiment that turned out phenomenally successful, except that it was with a patient who was going to die and wound up walking out of the hospital when that never would have happened. So we started bringing in patients and we studied hundreds of them, and it was very clear. We went from like 100% mortality to 93% remission. Some of them relapsed, but when you put them back on therapy, they went back into remission. So that was my first experience with the extraordinary gratification that you can get at a discovery that can be applied to other people.
So that is an incredible experience, an incredible success. And probably you could have continued in a whole career on autoimmunity. You already had this, made this major discovery, great reputation in the field. But then you came across this journal, Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report, which, by the way, does not sound like really great bedtime reading. But anyway, so you came across this report, and there was something interesting that caught your attention there. And your mentors also told you, because they could see your success, don't pursue that. Right. You know, that will be disastrous for your career. But what was it that caught your attention, and what gave you the confidence that this is what you should pursue?
Yeah. Well, that was 1981. The work that I just described was done in 1971, 72, 73. By the time we got to 1981, our protocol was used throughout the world. And what we were doing was interesting. We were doing, Journal of Experimental Nature type papers on, pathogenic mechanisms. But it was incremental, a good incremental. There's nothing wrong with incremental, but it wasn't the kind of thing that we did in those early years. So in the summer of 1981, the first MMWR, which was Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report, was of 5 young, otherwise previously healthy, curiously gay men from Los Angeles who presented with a form of pneumonia that I only saw on the cancer wards of people who were immunosuppressed. So why would a young, otherwise healthy gay man, I had no idea what it was. I thought it was a fluke. And at that time, in the gay community, people were using poppers or nitrous oxide to increase sexual satisfaction. I thought it was a fluke. 1 month later, in July of 81, the second MMWR came out. Now, not only 5, but curiously 26 all gay men from Los Angeles, San Francisco, and New York, who were presenting not only with this strange pneumonia, but with Kaposi sarcoma, which is only seen in immunocompromised people, and a whole host of opportunistic infections. I could say in all of my years in medicine, that's the first time that I actually got goosebumps, because I said, oh my God, we are dealing with a brand new disease. I've been in infectious disease now for 9 years, from 72 to 81. I never, ever saw this. And gay men have been in the world since the world began with humans. So this was not something new. And that's when I decided, as you were alluding to, Ron, that I decided to do something that was rather dramatic, and that was to completely turn around the direction of my career and start bringing in these young gay men who had a disease that was killing them within 8 to 10 months of the diagnosis, a disease without a name, a disease who had no etiology, but that I was convinced was an infectious disease because it was epidemiology was screaming that this was a transmissible, infectious, sexually transmitted disease, and it was attacking the immune system. So here I am, Tony Fauci, an infectious disease guy who's an immunologist. So what better thing for me to do to say, I want to turn around? And you're right, my mentor is the wise person who generously put me on the vasculitis project, said, Tony, don't give up your day job because this is probably going to go away, which obviously it didn't. So that's what I've been doing for the last 43 years as my research, both clinically and from a bench standpoint, has always been delving into HIV.
So take a chance and use your intuition.
Well, yeah, it is. I tell this to students and fellows that have come through my lab over the last several decades, is career paths are almost, at least for me, has never been linear. I mean, you could plan the trajectory of where you want to go, but it's a zigzag effect. I mean, I didn't know, I thought I wanted to be a practicing doc on York Avenue. And when I went to the NIH, I decided to become a scientist. And I did that for 9 years. And then all of a sudden, this brand new disease came, and I went this way and started studying that. So, expect the unexpected, but also take use of new opportunities that fall in front of you.
Yeah, wonderful advice. Well, maybe now we could transition to talk about, these big pandemics that have kind of bookended your time at the NIH. So we started talking about AIDS, but it might be interesting to hear you kind of compare and contrast AIDS and COVID-19. So two very different viruses requiring very different scientific and public health strategies, and also two pandemics that happened at very different times in society. You know, the HIV AIDS before the internet, if some of you can't imagine that, but there was such a time. And, you know, COVID-19, which is, you know, times we're living in right now. But, you know, maybe we could start off with the basic science, because I think you led into it very well. Here's a brand new disease. It's kind of comes out of nowhere. We know very little about it, if anything, and we have to work from there. We have to like build up the knowledge and figure out a strategy to treat it. So maybe we could talk about the scientific breakthroughs that made that possible, both at the time, but also looking backward in time, you know, the knowledge that was built up that allowed one to tackle these diseases. So maybe we can start with AIDS first.
Yeah, let me try to be as succinct as possible, because it really is a beautiful story that is extraordinary, I would say, reason why basic science investment is so critical. So let's turn the clock back and go before HIV. If you look at the years of research that could not possibly have been geared towards a disease that had not yet occurred, so you can't say it's directed research. So you have Howard Temin, David Baltimore discovering reverse transcriptase. You have Bob Gallo being able to grow T cells in culture with T cell growth factor, which happened to be IL-2. And then you had the discovery of the first retrovirus, which was HTLV-1, which was leading to human T cell leukemia. Those all antedated HIV. So then when you have this new disease that looks like it's attacking T cells, so what you need to do is to try and isolate the virus that's looking like a retrovirus. And the only way you're going to be able to study that is by using reverse transcriptase as an indicator of the growth of the virus in culture. You got to be able to grow the virus in T cells. And the only way you do that is by creating T cell lines through IL-2. So all of the investment in basic research led to the ability of going from a disease without a name, without an etiology, to research that really is the beautiful trajectory of research. Some research is incremental, but incremental is important. And every once in a while, you get a transforming breakthrough. So from 1981, when I admitted the first patient that I took care of in the fall of 1981 with this brand new disease, which wasn't yet called AIDS, I was an immunologist. So the only thing I was studying was the immune defect. So we were incrementally getting an appreciation. What is the receptor? What is the mechanism of cell killing? Is it cytolytic? Just what is it? Then in 1983, Montagnier and Francois Barré-Sinoussi discovers the virus, and Bob Gallo shows a combination of virology and epidemiology that it's the cause of AIDS. That was the transforming breakthrough. The next one occurred the next year in 1985 when a test for HIV was developed, because when patients were coming into the hospital, the only ones we saw were the ones that were desperately ill, because if they weren't sick, why would they go to a doctor? And even if they were not feeling well, we didn't have any tests to show what it was. We were seeing, and this was the thing that really broke my heart, because we were seeing a lot of these gay men and some injection drug users, but in the beginning it was mostly young gay men who would come in with absolutely advanced disease that was terrible. And we didn't know what the total scope of HIV was. Once we started to do serosurveillance in different populations, I almost got a heart attack looking at the data. You would do it in Greenwich Village and find out that 40 to 50% of the gay men in Greenwich Village were already infected. We went to the Castro district in San Francisco. 55% of the young men who were living in the Castro were infected. So we were saying, oh my God, this thing has been going on and it's many, 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 many times worse. That was the next big breakthrough. Then we took care of patients. It was the dark years of my medical career because I went from the young hotshot who developed a cure or a remission for the disease of the vessels that you were talking about to bringing in these, 10, 15, 20 at a time, gay men, all of whom, with very few exceptions, were dying. So it went from all of my patients walking out of the hospital to all of my patients dying. We did that, and then the next big breakthrough was 1986, 87, when AZT, the first drug, that was a very important breakthrough. It wasn't the answer, suppressed the virus, but didn't suppress it completely. Then the transforming breakthrough occurred in 1996 when the triple combination of drugs, spearheaded by the protease inhibitors, for the first time brought the virus to below detectable level and kept it there so they wouldn't get resistance, because with AZT and double combination, even with two good drugs, you bring the virus to below detectable, not to below detectable level, to a lower level. But once virus replicates, it's an RNA virus. For absolutely certain, you're going to get resistance. And that's what happened, where people did well for a while and then relapse. Once we got the virus to below detectable, that's when the whole terrain changed completely. That we got better and better with better drugs, less toxic. We went from, taking 28 pills a day to taking 1 pill a day. And that's where we are right now, where you actually have people who, if you get them early in infection, they could essentially lead an almost normal lifespan if you treat them. So it went from almost, I wouldn't say despair, because it was never despair. We always knew there would be a scientific solution. But it went from the dark days of taking care of people who are going to die to it becomes an outpatient disease. I mean, I don't have any patients. When I left the NIH at the end of 2022, I didn't have any inpatients with HIV. They were all outpatients. And they were outpatients to come in and say, hello, how you doing? Not that they needed any problems, right?
So let's talk about the science of COVID-19. And hearing that story, COVID-19 is science on warp speed.
Right.
So in the case of HIV, the story that you told, it was almost 2 years from that WR, to get the acronym right, report to the isolation of the virus.
Right.
COVID-19, within weeks, there's a sequence of the virus.
January 10th, public, right. Okay.
January 10th, public. And things evolved very quickly in terms of the scientific response. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about what, in this case, you see as the key science that really allowed us to mount a strategy to that virus.
Another example, decades later, of the importance of the investment in basic fundamental science. Because, again, I'll go quickly, but it's really an important lesson that you all, when you talk and argue for investment in science, this is it. So there were two things that led to the miracle of COVID, namely a vaccine that was developed in less than a year that had a very high degree of efficacy and safety and has saved now tens of millions of lives globally. So what happened is that we had in 2005, Katie Carrico and Drew Weissman, who was one of the fellows in my laboratory, but I don't take any credit for what he did. I just got out of his way and let him do his work. We're studying how you can get RNA to not be essentially not being able to be used as a vaccine. If you make a modification of the molecule, you could now use it as a vaccine. They were working on that. They published their paper in Immunity in 2005, remember. So now we have COVID in the end of 2019, the beginning of 2020. Then you had immunogen design, where, getting back to the link between HIV and COVID, for decades, structural biologists all over the country, at La Jolla and Boston, but also at the Vaccine Research Center at the NIH, were working on cryo-EM structural conformation of the envelope protein to develop an HIV vaccine, which, as you know, we don't have an HIV vaccine yet. But they were able to show how you can stabilize a molecule, because all of these molecules are floppy. You guys know that. It's very tough to get a vaccine. So they were able to stabilize it by mutations. In the Vaccine Research Center, a guy named Barney Graham, who was working on RSV, was trying to figure out how to stabilize the F protein of RSV in its pre-fusion, highly immunogenic form. He learned that from Peter Kwong, who was the HIV guy stabilizing the envelope. So they figured out what mutations, 2 mutations, to get the spike protein of a coronavirus, which was MERS at the time, to be stabilized in its pre-fusion form. So as soon as the sequence of SARS-CoV-2 became available, they did something in days that would have taken years. They were working with Moderna to develop an mRNA. Pfizer was doing it on their own. I remember I was sitting in my conference room, and I called in my team and I said, we have a new disease. We don't know how bad it's going to be, but let's start making a vaccine right now. Barney said on the 3rd or the 4th of January, get me the sequence and we'll start the vaccine, developing it in days, which, if you told somebody on the outside, they'd tell you you're crazy. What do you mean in days? So 5 days after we got the sequence, we partnered with Moderna. We started making the vaccine. 65 days later, we were in a phase 1 trial. 160 days later, we were in a phase 2 trial. 198 days later, we were in a phase 3 trial. With Operation Warp Speed, we tried it in 30,000 people in multiple clinical trials. By the end of November of 2020, less than 11 months, we had a vaccine that was proven to be safe and 94 to 95% effective then. We didn't understand the durability of protection, but it was 95% to 94% protective against clinical COVID. Okay, so if you look at the comparison now of the average amount of time it takes from understanding what the pathogen is to getting a vaccine is 7 to 10 years. This was 11 months. So you could imagine how many more people globally would have died if we didn't have a vaccine in 11 months. That was a beautiful example of the investment going back many, many years in basic science. So whenever I did go before, and right now I go before the Congress, but it's only to yell at me. But back then, when I would go before the Congress, to explain the importance of basic research, that's the most important example of that.
So I have maybe a brief question, but just hearing this story. So there's the immunogen, but there are many strategies for delivering the immunogen. And from what I remember, there are many horses in the race.
Right.
So there are like 10 to 20 vaccine programs going on. There's inactivated virus.
Right.
There's delivering the immunogen through various recombinant means. And, then there almost was like the dark horse in the race, which was mRNA.
Right.
And, also this is certainly what you want to do is try everything and such a, important objective. But I'm just curious, did you expect the mRNA to come out on...
I expected mRNA to come out because my team, who had been working on mRNA for years with Drew and with Moderna and doing it in MERS and other of the early things, they told me, Tony, this is going to work. And these are people who don't have bravado. They just talk to me based on what they weren't bragging like, okay, I'll do it. Just give it to me. They said, this is going to work. So even though we had many horses in the race, I was confident that mRNA would work. What blew me away was in the cold of the winter, when we were all sheltering out, eating outside, which I was doing with my neighbors. We would sit outside in 30-degree weather with our coats on and eat dinner. Incredible. What a time. I get a phone call from Albert Bourla from Pfizer, and he says, Tony, are you sitting down? And I said, oh, shit, this is going to be bad news. And he said, it's over 90% effective. I was hoping for a 60% and at the most 70% effective. The fact that it was over 90% completely blew me away. Yeah.
So maybe we can get now to science communication and kind of the public view of science. You know, this is such an amazing success story, you know, almost accelerating of vaccine development by an order of magnitude, hitting a 90% mark, not a 60% mark. It was also one of the most remarkable epics I've seen in science, where so many scientists dropped whatever project they were working on to use their talents to tackle some problem in COVID-19. And out of that, you know, came the vaccines, the drugs like Paxlovid and so forth. But, you know, somehow it seems like we lost the narrative of that story to, I'm not sure what, but to fear or misinformation or so forth. Yeah. So maybe you could even, as a broader question, even you've witnessed, you know, public engagement around science around the time of AIDS and the time of COVID. And maybe you could just reflect on, you know, what are some of the lessons learned, what has proven successful, what have been, you know, the shortfalls, and eventually we could talk about how to move forward.
Yeah. Well, it was like the difference between apples and watermelons difference. When we were dealing with HIV, it was not a generalized outbreak in the United States. It was very restricted to a certain demographic group. So the issue of communication between the scientific community and the people at risk, which was not people who were heterosexual, non-injection drug users, non-commercial sex workers. The chances of someone who went about their daily business of getting HIV was like zero if you weren't at a risk group. So the population we were dealing with was the gay community and to some extent injection drug users. We learned a lesson from them, Ron, that the traditional scientific approach and regulatory approach that works beautifully for diseases that are not diseases that are going to kill you in 10 to 12 months. The rigidity of the regulatory process, the inclusion and exclusion criteria in clinical trials worked well. And the scientific community, including me early on, but I quickly pivoted, and I think that relates to my training as a humanist and not strictly as a scientist, is that the gay community was saying, we want a seat at the table to let you know that the design of your clinical trial is incompatible with the nature of the disease. You're talking about, we have no other hope, and you're talking about very, very strong restriction criteria, and the regulatory process is going to take forever to get a drug approved. So we want to sit down at the table. The scientific community, understandably, but retrospectively now, totally unacceptably pushed back on them. So they went from trying to get our attention to being provocative, iconoclastic, theatrical, and disruptive. And they started attacking the scientists, and particularly me, because I was the public face of HIV, because early on in the 80s, I was one of the few people that was out there talking about it, doing research. It wasn't like you go to the International AIDS meeting now, there are 40,000 people there. There were 11 of us in 1981 that were doing it. So their attacking was they wanted us to listen to what they were saying. So they had nothing against science. They were not anti-science. They were pro-science. They just wanted flexibility. So one of the best things I did in my career was I put aside the theatrics and I listened to what they were saying. And what they were saying was making perfect sense. And I said, if I were in their shoes, I would be doing exactly what they were doing. That's when we brought them in. They didn't want to disrupt any institutions. They didn't want to tear anything down. They wanted input into what we were doing. That is 1,000% different. Fast forward to COVID.
Well, I mean, before you get to COVID, I just want to say and single out the importance of listening.
Yeah.
And what a difference that makes, and what a difference in trust. And just for the audience, there's a fantastic documentary made by PBS. PBS Masters on Dr. Fauci. And there is a great scene there where you're in a living room with, the AIDS activists, Larry Kramer and others, and you're sitting in this living room with this sense of camaraderie that, we all contributed, we all listened, and we did something really important together. And just watching that scene, I think, is incredible.
Yeah, those were that was a 25, 30-year later scene, because one of the scenes was when I first went down to the Gay and Lesbian Community Center in Greenwich Village and sat down among about 50 frightened, sick, angry gay men who were trying to get the attention of the government. Never for a moment did I feel in danger, because they didn't want to. They weren't anti-science. They weren't anti-scientist. They wanted to have a seat at the table. Then when I said, you fast forward to COVID, where it's different, because now it's a generalized outbreak. So everybody is concerned about it. And what we had, and I think, that's my opinion. There are a lot of issues about COVID, which was horrible. We've lost 1.17 million people. But the issue there was that it occurred at a time with social media, which we didn't have in 1982, 3, 4, 5, 6, at a time when there was such profound divisiveness in society, not diversity. Diversity is great. You want to be far right, you want to be far left, you want to be center. But it was total divisiveness that translated itself into a pushing back on any authority. You can't tell me what I should do. So that pushing back on authority, with the already smoldering anti-vax from the measles group, turned out to be an anti-vax, anti-science, and then anti-scientist. So you had the extremes who were attacking public health officials. Whenever could you imagine that public health officials and scientists would get attacked by harassment, by threats, and then even some real threats that are really credible threats? That was so different than the gay men in the Gay and Lesbian Community Center who just wanted me to listen to what they had to say. It really is a big, big difference. It was people that wanted to tear down and challenge science, like, you scientists keep flip-flopping. And one of the problems, that we all know, we're scientists, is that science is a process to gain information that would allow you to make recommendations and allow you to make guidelines. We were dealing with a moving target. I mean, whenever did we see a respiratory illness that the ones we were interested in was the influenza model? You have influenza. It may be a different influenza each year a little bit, and every once in a while you get a pandemic. But during the influenza season, you get a peak, it goes down, and then you're done. You don't have 5 different influenzas in the same season. We're in our 5th season of COVID, and we're on JN1.1, which is now 86.5%. But that is so phylogenetically different from the original ancestral strain, which went from alpha to beta to gamma to Omicron, which started in November of 2021. And then there have been, take a look at the phylogenetic tree, multiple different derivatives of Omicron. So the group out there that has suspicion about science to begin with says, wait a minute, what are you talking about? You tell me that this is a virus that doesn't spread very well from person to person, because that's what the Chinese were saying in the beginning. And then 3 weeks later, you say, oops, it is spreading very well from person to person. And then a month later, you tell us it's one of the most transmissible viruses we've ever seen. And the reason is we didn't know on January 10th how transmissible it was. We didn't know in April and May and June that instead of having a season peak and go down, we were going to have virus right through the summer, into the fall, into the next winter, which broke every paradigm of a respiratory infection. So instead of the community understanding that science is self-correcting, they didn't understand that science is self-correcting. So if you even have the slightest trouble with authority, and we scientists are considered part of the authority, then you wind up having the mess that we had, where people are anti-science and anti-scientists. So the reason I spoke a little bit longer on that, because having lived through the HIV experience and this experience, people say, well, people were protesting with HIV and they were protesting here. Very, very different. Very different.
Well, just thinking about this, how we communicate science and even how we teach it in schools. I mean, science appears to be information,
right? And
not a process of tackling the unknown, learning about it, evolving your thinking. In some cases, even discovering what you thought was not the right
self-correcting.
Path. Self-correcting. So, people want certainty. I mean, that is part of the human emotional brain, to want that, even though it's an unrealistic part of life. Yeah. But do you have any thoughts on, how we teach science, not just as information, but also as a process?
Yeah. Well, that's a great question. When I get asked that, one of the things that I say it's important is that we need to really increase science literacy, down from the beginning of our elementary schools up through high school. We've got to make it part. I mean, if you compare our science literacy with science literacy in Asian countries, they got us. They outgun us, when it comes to that easily. I mean, once you get past it to the graduate level, our scientists are the best scientists in the world, quite frankly, mostly because we get good support and we're pretty smart. There are pretty smart people in other parts of the world, but very little support for science that we see here. But at the level of school children and beyond, to understand some degree of understanding science. You said something very interesting, that people expect certainty in science. Well, they need to understand there are many different sciences. We're involved, at least I'm involved, in the biomedical sciences. That's very different from the physical and mathematical sciences. So if you want certainty, try math. In January, 2 plus 2 equals 4 in January of 2020. In April of 2024, 2 plus 2 still equals 4. But the virus in January of 2020 is very different from the virus in April of 2024.
Okay, let me pick up on that theme, which is the next virus. And let's hope it's not some derivative of JN1. But sometime during this century, undoubtedly, there will be another big pandemic, if not multiple, for sure. And you said in life sciences across the globe, when we did that interview together, you said, I hope that we will have a lessons learned discussion, a serious discussion, not a blame game, but a discussion of productivity, collaboration, and solidarity among countries throughout the world. How can we learn from each other? So my question to you is, has that discussion happened?
No. It's been the opposite. It's been absolutely the opposite. I know you all have important things to do with this wonderful facility that you're in, but sometime you should try and follow the oversight hearings on the select committee for the coronavirus pandemic. It is stunning. The title, they called together two scientists, two highly credible scientists, Christian Anderson and Bob Gary, Christian from La Jolla and Bob from Tulane. Very, very important evolutionary virologists who are serious people. And they were talking about what their vision was and the data that they collected and published in 2 papers in Science and 1 in Cell about what they felt the origin. We still don't know exactly what the origin is, but the data are really weighing very heavily as a natural occurrence, even though there's the lab leak possibility, which you got to keep an open mind, which we all do, keep an open mind. But the hearing, which should have been, how do we do better for the next time that's a possibility? The title of the hearing was, the paper that Christian and Bob wrote was Proximal Origin of SARS-CoV-2. They entitled the hearing, the Republican majority, The Origins of a Cover-Up was the title of the hearing. Now that's really open-minded, isn't it? Okay. So then last week, they had a hearing where they called multiple editors of the scientific journals. The only one that showed up, they called for Nature, Science, and Lancet. The only one that showed up was Holden Thorpe from Science. So the title of that hearing, which should have been, how do the scientific community and the editors get information? How do you process information? The title of the hearing was Academic Malpractice. So I think that answers your question, is are we trying to get lessons learned to how we approach the preparation and the response for the next outbreak, when what you're having now is the gotcha game. It's becoming a political football back and forth. You have the Democrats say one thing at a hearing, the Republicans say another thing at the hearing. So I'm very pessimistic that at least through the congressional process that we're going to have a real look at what we did right and what we did wrong. And we did a lot of things right and we did things wrong. And we've got to learn from that. But that doesn't seem to be what's going on right now.
So maybe this, looking at the time, stimulates my last question, but you can take your time to answer it. An optimistic ending here. So you've been 54 years in service of the government at the NIH. I mean, it is one of the most exemplary careers I can think of, certainly in science, in public service. So I think the audience would love to hear what public service means to you. And following on that, how do we get the next generation of, Anthony Fauci's to pass the ball to? Yeah. Because, that's what this world needs.
Yeah. Well, the way I explain it is that there is official public service in your official position. So when you work the way I have for my entire professional career for the United States federal government, the government is in service of the people. So I'll give you my perspective of it, but then also talk a little bit about other elements of public service. So for me, for my background, how I grew up, the story I told you from my parents to my training in Jesuit schools, it was just a natural feeling of gratification of doing things for other people. And there are so many ways you can do things for other people, for the service of the country, to make the world a better place. I happen to choose medicine and science to do that. So many of us are doing all the same thing, but I'm doing it in the context of the total purpose of what I'm doing is to serve the public. Now, the one thing I want people to understand, that when I talk about public service, that a person like yourselves, as scientists, whether you're a physician or a PhD or whatever scientific approach you take, in many respects, that is public service if you make it public service. If your primary motivation is self-aggrandizement, which given the human species, there are people who that's their motivation. But there's something about if your motivation is to do something good to make the world a better place, it's really a great feeling. It's a great feeling while you're doing it. And it's a great feeling when you reflect back on what you've done. So to me, that's all the gratification that I need. I mean, you work for the federal government. You don't exactly get rich working for the federal government, but it doesn't really matter because the other gratifications that you get just outweigh that completely.
And now you're at Georgetown, and I think part of the reason why you're at Georgetown is also to talk to young people, talk to students, and kind of convey that spirit. So why is this like an exciting next thing that you want to do in your career?
Well, I asked myself as we got towards I stayed on an extra year because the president asked me to be his chief medical advisor. And I had known Joe Biden from the time he was a senator. So there's no way that I was going to say no to that. So I stayed on. But I was thinking about stepping down. And I was saying to myself, in the years that I have left of being still alert, still energetic, still passionate, and thankfully still healthy, what do I really want to do? Do I want to continue to do bench science? Do I want to continue to do clinical trials? And the answer, interestingly, was no, because if I wanted to continue to have an impact that was really value added as opposed to just little increments, then I wanted to see if I could use my career as an inspiration or a model for younger people who might be interested either in public service or even going into science to show how important a career in science would be. So I decided that I wanted to do that in a university setting where I could appeal to people at the earliest stages of their career. So Georgetown was perfect for me because for those of you who don't know Georgetown is in the middle of the northwest section of DC, and it's multiple different schools. You have the medical school here, my office is here, the medical school is here, the undergraduate arts and sciences here, the nursing school is here, the School of Foreign Service is here, and the only one that's downtown is the law school. So you have the opportunity of interacting with everything from a first-year college student to somebody who's graduating from medical school to the residents in the hospital. It's like a candy store for me because I have the opportunity to talk in seminars to young people, to try and get them to be excited about what they're doing. And that's what I'm enjoying. I mean, I've dealt with fellows and postdocs for 54 years. So I wanted to go down a level to see if we can get people inspired to go into science. So that's why I'm really enjoying very, very much being at Georgetown.
Well, we're inspired. I am sure they will be incredibly inspired. And I do thank you for coming. I would like to close, actually, with another quote you have, which is the very last page of this book, Expect the Unexpected. It's the final page. And it says, if historians look back at what I've done in my life, I hope they see a life of commitment to having a positive impact on society, and I've had some degree of success in doing so. Maybe somebody many years from now goes back and reads about this and says, hey, that guy was pretty good. Well, all I'd like to say is that in this audience and the many patients whose lives you're saved, their families, there would be many stadiums filled with people who would actually, I believe, say, hey, that guy was more than pretty good. He is simply the best. So, Dr. Fauci, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much.
So we now have a reception. I think if anyone would like to come say hello to you,
Sure.
You're here for a few minutes. And otherwise, I thank everyone in the audience for coming. And I know this incredibly memorable event for all of us.
Thank
and
you.
Again, thank you for your service to science and service to the world.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.